June 25, 1950, a date that saw the Korean peninsula engulfed in the flames of war. This was the day North Korea, backed by the might of the Soviet Union and China, launched an unexpected and ruthless invasion on their southern neighbors. The tranquility of a summer dawn was shattered as artillery fire rained down on the 38th parallel, the line that had once peacefully divided North and South Korea. As the North Korean forces, armed with Soviet tanks and aircraft, rolled across the border, they faced little resistance. The South Korean military, caught off guard and significantly outgunned, found themselves retreating under the onslaught. It was a swift and brutal advance that culminated in the capture of Seoul, the capital of South Korea, just 3 short days after the invasion began. The world watched in shock as the events unfolded. The United Nations Security Council, in an unprecedented move, convened an emergency session. For the first time in its young history, it flexed its muscles, passing a resolution condemning the North Korean aggression and calling for an immediate ceasefire. The Soviet Union, a veto-wielding member of the Security Council, was notably absent from this vote, having boycotted the council over its refusal to recognize the People's Republic of China. But the North Korean forces, emboldened by their initial successes, ignored the international outcry and pressed on. South Korea, reeling from the onslaught, called for assistance, and the United States, under President Harry S. Truman, pledged its support. It was a move that marked the first military action of the Cold War, drawing the battle lines not just on the Korean peninsula, but across the world. And so, in the sultry heat of that summer, the fire of the Korean War was ignited. A war that was not just about the division of a nation, but a reflection of the global power dynamics of the time. The stage was set for a conflict that would reverberate around the world. The United Nations, led by the United States, entered the fray, turning the tables on the North Korean advance. This move marked a significant pivot in the Korean War, as the world's largest international organization stepped in to quell the escalating conflict. The United Nations had a clear mission: to push back against the North Korean forces and restore peace on the Korean peninsula. A multinational coalition of 21 countries rallied behind this cause, pooling their resources and manpower in a unified front against an advancing enemy. As the United Nations forces began to push back, they made significant strides. The North Korean forces, once seemingly unstoppable, found themselves on the defensive. Inch by inch, mile by mile, the UN forces regained lost ground. Their efforts culminated in the recapture of Seoul, the capital of South Korea, a major victory that marked a turning point in the war. At the helm of this resurgence was a figure of unquestionable military prowess, General Douglas MacArthur. A veteran of World War II and a mastermind in military strategy, MacArthur orchestrated one of the most audacious maneuvers of the war, the Incheon landings. This daring amphibious assault behind enemy lines resulted in a decisive victory for the UN forces, significantly weakening the North Korean army and shifting the momentum of the war. But success came with a price. As the United Nations forces pushed past the 38th parallel, the original boundary between North and South Korea, they ventured into uncharted territory. It was an aggressive move, a bold statement of intent, but it was also a move that stirred the hornet's nest. Unbeknownst to the United Nations, their actions were being closely watched by another major power, one that had thus far remained on the sidelines. As UN forces continued their advance, they unknowingly sparked the ire of a sleeping giant. But as the UN forces pushed past the 38th parallel, they unknowingly sparked the ire of a sleeping giant. In the face of the advancing UN forces, China made a bold move. The intervention of the People's Republic of China in the Korean War was a game changer. As the United Nations forces, spearheaded by the United States, were on the verge of a decisive victory, China stepped onto the stage, changing the dynamics of the war. In late October 1950, China launched its first phase offensive, sending over 300,000 troops across the Yalu River into Korea. This massive force was not just a military intervention, but a statement of China's newfound power and determination to resist Western influence on its doorstep. The Chinese forces launched a massive counterattack, catching the UN forces off guard. Their tactical use of night attacks and ambushes, coupled with their vast numbers, pushed the UN forces back from the Chinese-Korean border. This marked the beginning of a series of battles that would turn the tide of the war. Among these, the Battle of Chosin Reservoir stands out. In sub-zero temperatures, UN forces found themselves surrounded and vastly outnumbered. Despite the odds, they fought their way out, inflicting heavy casualties on the Chinese. Yet, the Chinese onslaught was relentless, and the UN forces were pushed back further. By January 1951, the Communist forces had recaptured Seoul, the South Korean capital, for the second time. The rapid advance of the Chinese forces and the recapture of Seoul signaled a dramatic shift in the war. What had started as a civil war had escalated into an international conflict, a proxy war in the larger Cold War between the Western and Eastern blocs. The Korean Peninsula had become the battleground for these global power dynamics. By the spring of 1951, the war had reached a stalemate, with the UN forces managing to halt the Chinese advance. The battle lines hardened along the 38th parallel, the original border between North and South Korea. The war had reached a stalemate, with both sides digging in along the 38th parallel. 2 years of bitter fighting later, an armistice was finally signed on July 27, 1953. The ceasefire marked an end to the active hostilities of this brutal war, but not, as some might think, a formal conclusion. An armistice is a pause in fighting, a standstill, not a declaration of peace. The armistice led to the creation of the Korean Demilitarized Zone, or DMZ, a buffer zone that physically and symbolically divides the Korean peninsula. This 2.5-mile-wide strip of land, stretching from the East Sea to the Yellow Sea, stands as a stark reminder of a conflict that never officially ended. No formal peace treaty was ever signed, a detail that has left the two Koreas technically at war for over 7 decades. The human cost of the Korean War was staggering. It is estimated that nearly 3 million people perished, including a significant number of civilians. South Korea alone lost close to 1 million lives. North Korea, with its smaller population, suffered even more dramatically, with estimates suggesting that up to 1/5 of its populace was wiped out. The war left an indelible impact on the Korean peninsula. Economically, both nations were devastated. The infrastructure was in ruins, cities were decimated, and the task of rebuilding was daunting. Socially, families were torn apart, generations were lost, and the psychological scars still run deep. Politically, the war solidified the division between the North and the South. It reinforced ideologies, hardened stances, and further complicated the geopolitical landscape of the Cold War era. The war also had global implications. It set the stage for subsequent conflicts during the Cold War and influenced international relations and strategies for years to come. The Korean War, a conflict that began in fire and ended in ice, continues to shape the Korean peninsula to this day. It's a sobering testament to the far-reaching implications of global power dynamics and the immense human cost of war. The Korean War was a watershed moment in the Cold War era, impacting not just the Korean peninsula, but the entire world. This conflict was sparked by North Korea's initial invasion of South Korea in 1950, a move that set the stage for a dramatic struggle that would last 3 years. North Korea, buoyed by the backing of China and the Soviet Union, attempted to unify the Korean peninsula under its rule. Yet, their ambition was met with resistance as the United Nations stepped in to support South Korea. The tide began to turn when the United Nations forces, predominantly the United States, intervened. The UN's entry into the war was a significant moment, representing the global community's commitment to maintaining peace and stability. However, the conflict's trajectory took another dramatic shift when China entered the fray. China's involvement marked a new chapter in the war, escalating the conflict to a level that had significant implications for the global power dynamics. The war, initially a regional conflict, was now a stage for the world's superpowers to flex their muscles, a stark reflection of the intense rivalry between the East and West during the Cold War era. The armistice signed in 1953 brought an end to the active hostilities but did not officially end the war. The Korean peninsula was divided along the 38th parallel, creating a tense, demilitarized zone that remains to this day. The aftermath of the war left an indelible impact on the Korean peninsula, with millions of lives lost, cities destroyed, and families torn apart. In reflecting upon the Korean War, we see a conflict that was far more than a regional dispute. It was a pivotal moment in the Cold War, a proxy war that embodied the ideological divide of the time, and a stark reminder of the devastating toll of global power politics. The echoes of this conflict continue to reverberate, a stark reminder of a war that is over, yet unresolved.